Greetings, my wonderful students. Today we discuss a concept of unity and sectionalism in American history. Now, after the War of 1812, there was a feeling of unity in the nation, nationalism. By the 1816 election, the Federalist Party was almost dead, and James Monroe, the Republican candidate, won easily. This time was called the era of good feelings and had a growing sense of nationalism or pride in the country. The Republican Party, once a champion of states' rights, began to support more federal power. Henry Clay, Speaker of the House of Representatives, which would be the person in charge of the House of Representatives, wanted to create a nationalist program to help the country grow. His American system, as he called it, included tariffs or taxes on imports to help industry, a new bank of the United States, and internal improvements such as roads, bridges, and canals. He believed this would help the economy in every area of the country. The Second Bank of the United States. Now, the charter for the First Bank of the United States had expired in 1811 and was not renewed by Congress. That meant that there literally was no First Bank of the United States for the government anymore. In 1816, Congress passed a bill to create a Second Bank of the United States. There had been inflation during the War of 1812, and people felt that a new national bank could stabilize the currency and keep inflation in line. Remember, inflation is a rise in prices caused in part by having too much money into the system. Now, during the War of 1812, Britain had stopped trading with the United States, which makes sense because we were fighting a war with them, but they still kept manufacturing goods. So at the end of the war, the British had warehouses full of goods that they began selling to the United States at a price lower than what it costs to make them. So you might say, well, geez, Mr. Stone, they're losing money. Yes and no. The money that they spent to build those goods was already gone. So now the question was, how much money could they make selling what they'd been storing in a warehouse for 4 years? Or, 2 years. They did this practice, called dumping, to destroy American factories that had started during the war. The fact is, American businesses could not possibly compete with goods that were so cheap it cost less to sell them than it cost to make them. So as a result, American businesses were in danger of going bankrupt because the British were driving them out of business with this. So to protect the American industries, Congress passed the Tariff of 1816. People who imported foreign goods added the cost of the tariff to the prices of the goods they sold. So if you were importing goods from Britain, this new tariff meant you had to pay a tax to the government for the goods you were selling that came from Britain. In order for you to pay for this tax, what you would end up doing is putting that amount of money onto the price of the good you were selling from Britain. So this raises the cost of all the British goods. By raising the price of the foreign goods, it encouraged people in the U.S. to buy American-made goods, which were now cheaper than the British goods. Higher tariffs were passed in 1818 and in 1824. So you see it goes 1816, 1818, 1824, which caused some Americans to get angry because the price of a bunch of stuff they're buying is going up. And because most industries were in the North, the South saw little benefit from the tariffs. They didn't really care much about northern factories, but all the Southerners still had to pay higher prices for their goods. So sectionalism started. Differences in the goals and interests in different parts of the country began to grow, and this ended the era of good feelings. In the early 1800s, the country had 3 distinct sections: the North, the South, and the West. Now, the North was New England and the mid-Atlantic states. The South is what is today the Southeast, and the West was the land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. Each region had a strong voice in Congress, individuals who spoke for them. Henry Clay of Kentucky spoke for the West. Daniel Webster of Massachusetts spoke for the North, and John C. Calhoun spoke for the South. Now, in 3 court cases in the early 1800s, the Supreme Court supported greater power for the national government. In the court case Fletcher v. Peck in 1810, the court ruled that federal courts could declare state laws unconstitutional if they violated the national constitution. And in 1819, in the case of McCulloch v. Maryland, the court said that the national bank was constitutional under the necessary and proper clause, and that states could not tax it. The key here being that the states could not tax federal government power, and the national government was supreme. In 1824, in the case of Gibbons versus Ogden, the court ruled that only Congress had the power to make laws regarding trade between the states or interstate commerce. New York couldn't make a law that affected its own trade with New Jersey. That had to be done at the national level. In 1819, the Missouri Territory asked to become a state. Most settlers in Missouri had come from Kentucky and Tennessee, and they supported slavery. Representative James Talmadge proposed that Missouri be forced to gradually abolish slavery to be allowed to become a state. The House of Representatives passed the plan, but the Senate blocked it. You see, the North had a larger population than the South, and so they controlled the House of Representatives. However, in the Senate, the two sides were equal because there were 11 slave states and 11 free states, so they each had an equal amount of representatives in the Senate. The slave states were afraid of becoming a minority in both houses, and they would not allow another free state to be added without another slave state being added at approximately the same time. So the Missouri Compromise happened. The debates over slavery were getting heated, so Henry Clay suggested a compromise. This compromise would allow Missouri to enter as a slave state, and Massachusetts would give up land to create a new free state, which would be called Maine, keeping both sides equal in the Senate. In addition to this, a line would be drawn at 36 degrees 30 minutes north latitude, and slavery would be allowed south of this line in the territories, but not north of it for the rest of the Louisiana Territory. This compromise was only a temporary solution. The issue was going to come up again. In 1817, the Rush-Bagot Agreement, Britain and the United States agreed to limit the number of armed ships on the Great Lakes. And the Convention of 1818 set the northern boundary of the Louisiana Territory with Canada. Both sides also agreed to maintain the border between the United States and Canada without armed forces, so we didn't need to have troops on the border. John Quincy Adams, who was Secretary of State, also negotiated the right of American settlement into what is known as the Oregon Country. Now Spain controlled Florida, which included a strip of land along the Gulf Coast that reached all the way to Louisiana. American settlers in West Florida rebelled against Spanish rule, and the United States argued that the Louisiana Purchase included that land too. The U.S. took sections of West Florida in 1810 and 1812, and Spain objected to that, but took no actions. The Seminoles, Native Americans of East Florida, sometimes raided U.S. settlements in the state of Georgia. General Andrew Jackson was ordered to stop these raids. In the process, he followed the native forces into West Florida and seized Spanish forts. Now, he wasn't authorized to do this, but the U.S. government didn't stop him and didn't punish him for it. And Secretary of State Adams believed the Spanish wanted to settle the issue peacefully. So in the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, Spain ceded or gave up all claims and ownership to all of Florida and to the Oregon Country, which they claimed they should have a part of as well. And the U.S., however, agreed to Spanish ownership of Texas, which the U.S. had not settled at that point. Spain's losing power here. In 1810, a priest named Miguel Hidalgo led a rebellion in Mexico. Now, he was captured and executed by the Spanish, but he already got the ball rolling. By 1821, Mexico had gained its independence from Spain. And Simon Bolivar, known as the Great Liberator, led many independence movements in South America, what had been a huge part of the Spanish Empire, and this guy is leading independence movements there. José de San Martín achieved independence for Chile and Peru. And by 1824, Spain had lost control of most of South America, so their colonial empire is basically done. Now in 1822, France, Russia, Austria, and Prussia discussed a plan to help Spain regain its colonies in the Americas. The United States was concerned with further European involvement in the Western Hemisphere, that's half of the globe, and President James Monroe issued a statement. The Monroe Doctrine, as it's called, stated the United States would not interfere with European affairs or European colonies that existed in the Americas, but that Europe should not try to gain any more colonies in the Americas or try to regain colonies that had been lost. And I hope you enjoyed this lesson.